After a long and tiring day, she collapsed into the plush armchair by the window and let out a sigh that reverberated throughout her opulent home. With the burden of her obligations pressing down on her shoulders from meetings, deadlines, and family duties, she hardly had time for herself anymore. She closed her eyes for a brief moment of peace before a gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. The voice of her servant, a young man who had worked in her home for more than a year, came in. He was polite and respectful, but there was always a softness in his voice when he spoke to her. She hadn't given it much thought before, but today his words felt different. "I'm fine, ma'am. You look like you're carrying the world on your shoulders," she said. "I'm just tired," trying to brush off the exhaustion that had crept into her bones. "But I could use a little help with these knots in my back." He paused for a moment before entering the room, and then he offered to help her with that. "I learned some techniques that might help ease the tension." There was a kindness in his offer, and even though it was unexpected, she found herself nodding. She had always thought of him as a part of the household, someone who took care of the things she didn't have time for, but tonight in her vulnerable state, she realized how little she really knew about him. Tonight everything felt different. She said, "Thank you," but she wasn't sure why she felt so strangely comfortable with him in such a private moment. As his hands started to gently massage her shoulders, she let herself relax into his touch. The room was quiet except for the gentle rhythm of his hands working on her muscles. At first, she didn't give it much thought because it was just a simple gesture that many would give to a friend or loved one. But as the minutes went by, she started to feel something she hadn't anticipated, something warm, subtle, and unquestionably comforting. She couldn't recall the last time someone had looked after her in this way. In the silence, she wondered if there was more to this moment than she had first realized, but she quickly brushed the idea from her mind. She was the employer, he was the servant, and that was the extent of their relationship. She had known him for a long time, but something about this small act of kindness felt different. "Is this all right?" she asked herself. His hands were strong but gentle, moving with purpose and care. He inquired in a whispery voice as his fingers moved down her spine, and she blinked briefly in surprise at the sensitivity in his tone. "Yes," she said, her voice a little lower than she meant to. "It feels nice." For a brief moment, their eyes met in the mirror across the room. There was something unspoken between them, something that neither of them could name. It was the kind of look that held more weight than words. Ever could the tension in the air shifted subtly, but it was there. She tried to focus on her thoughts, tried to distract herself from the strange sensation stirring in her chest, but it was difficult to ignore the warmth spreading through her body. He was so close, his presence so comforting, and yet the proximity made her heart race in a way she hadn't expected. She felt exposed yet, strangely protected as he continued. The rhythm of his hands seemed to synchronize with the beat of her heart. The minutes stretched on, but she didn't want this moment to end. She had no reason to feel so attached to it. After all, he was just her servant. But in that quiet, intimate space, it felt like something more. When he finally stepped back, his hands leaving her skin, a quiet sigh escaped her lips. She felt both relieved and disappointed the moment was over, but the sensation of his touch lingered, as if it had carved something new into the quiet of her mind. "Thank you," she said, turning slightly to face him. "I needed that." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'm glad I could help," and with that, he left the room, leaving her alone with the strange newfound warmth that continued to swirl within her. She sat in silence, her thoughts swirling in a mix of confusion and curiosity. What had just happened? It was just a simple massage after all. But as she sat there, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something. Neither of them had anticipated the next few days, passed in a haze of routine, yet something had shifted between them. She noticed it in the way she anticipated his presence in the house, in the quiet moments when he crossed her path, and how she caught herself thinking about the massage long after it had ended. Every time he came into the room, she felt a strange flutter in her chest, as if something unspoken had tethered them together in a way she couldn't fully understand. That evening, after a particularly long day, she found herself sitting at her desk, feeling the familiar weight of stress creeping up her spine. The phone calls, emails, and paperwork seemed endless, and she could feel the familiar tightness building in her back again. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise of her thoughts, but the tension refused to release. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right? You look tense again." He entered his usual professional demeanor, but she could sense something different in the way he carried himself, the same undercurrent of unspoken words that had lingered since their last encounter. As he approached, she noticed how his eyes seemed to hesitate just for a moment before they met hers. It was subtle, but it wasn't missed. "Would you like me to help with your back again?" His voice was calm and steady as ever, and she looked up her mind without thinking. "I could use a little help again," she replied, her voice softer than usual. She heard the tiniest hint of hesitation in his tone, as if he weren't sure whether he should even ask, but she found herself nodding before she could stop herself. "Yes, please," she whispered softly. He inquired in a slightly quieter voice than normal. Her heart suddenly raced as he started to move his hands gently into her shoulders once more in a soothing manner. There was a new tension between them that was thick and tangible, and her muscles that had been stiff with stress seemed to relax at the first touch. However, this time, she felt more than just physical relief. Rather, he was moving with a care that felt almost intimate and personal, too close for what she had anticipated. Days turned into weeks, and the unspoken tension between them grew. She found herself restless in his presence, her thoughts drifting to him in the quiet moments of the day. At first, she tried to dismiss it, rationalizing that it was just the result of stress and exhaustion. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more the feeling seemed to intensify. Her interactions with him became more charged. The simple acts of him handing her a cup of tea or adjusting the curtains at her request now carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. It was as if their every glance and every brush of their hands was infused with a current neither could name. She caught herself lingering longer than usual in his presence, not out of necessity, but because she didn't want to let go of the connection that had begun to form between them. One evening after an especially taxing day, she found herself standing by the window, staring out at the city lights below, lost in thought. Her back was aching again, a familiar reminder of the long hours she had spent hunched over her desk. The tension was almost unbearable now. A constant companion without thinking, she called out to him, her voice soft, betraying her vulnerability. "Could you help me again with my back?" She asked, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. His response came almost immediately. "Of course, ma'am," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of something else he had been helping her regularly over the past few weeks. But tonight, something felt different. She wasn't sure if it was the quiet urgency in his tone or the fact that she had never needed this comfort as much as she did now. He entered the room, and as he moved toward her, their eyes met for a fleeting moment. She could see the familiar warmth in his gaze, but now there was something else there, something more intimate, more daring. She quickly looked away, trying to compose herself, but the flutter in her chest didn't subside, it only grew stronger. "Let me help you get comfortable," he said, his voice low as if aware of the tension that hung in the air between them. She nodded, unsure of what to say, her heart beating faster than she could explain. He worked gently, his hands moving to her shoulders with practiced ease. But this time it felt different. There was more intention behind his touch, an undeniable care in the way his fingers worked to ease the tension in her muscles. Every touch of his hands seemed to last a little while longer, as if he was also hesitant to end the moment. As he moved down her back, she found herself leaning into his warm, firm, and steady hands, craving the comfort he provided. The sensation of his hands gliding over her skin sent a wave of heat through her, and she tried to keep her breathing steady. But it was impossible to ignore how his touch stirred something deep within her. Her thoughts, which had previously been clear and focused, now seemed muddled, and she could feel the quiet pull between them, a magnetic force neither of them had acknowledged until now. "How does that feel?" His voice was barely above a whisper, and his question was straightforward. "It feels good," she said, swallowing and trying to gather herself before responding. Her voice was soft and nearly breathless, and she detested how vulnerable she sounded. But there was no going back now that she couldn't act as though this moment didn't mean anything. His hands paused for a second, and for the smallest of seconds, everything seemed to stop. The air felt heavy and thick, with their unspoken understanding. Her heart raced as she tried to regain her composure, but the heat from his touch lingered, settling deep within her. "I'm glad," he said, his voice sounding almost too calm, but she could hear the subtle change in it, the way it betrayed his own struggle to keep his distance as he continued his movements seemed to change. There was a softness in his touch, a tenderness that she hadn't noticed before. The way his hands worked, her muscles was almost like an expression of care, of something beyond the professional. She felt her body responding, the warmth of his touch spreading through her, igniting a longing she couldn't ignore. She told herself it was just a massage, that it was nothing more than him doing his job. But the longer he stayed, the more impossible it became to deny the growing feelings between them. He was more than just a servant. Now he was someone who had touched her in ways no one else had, not just physically, but emotionally. The lines between employer and servant were blurring, and she couldn't help but wonder where this would lead. When he finished, his hands finally left her back, and the silence that followed was deafening. She sat up slowly, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened. The connection between them was undeniable, but she wasn't sure what it meant or how to navigate it. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than usual. She felt the words hanging between them, carrying a weight neither of them could ignore. He nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes. It was as if he too recognized the shift. But neither of them spoke about it. Instead, he simply said, "You're welcome," before quietly leaving the room, leaving her with the lingering sensation of his touch and the undeniable pull that now connected them in ways neither of them could fully understand. The next morning brought no clarity, only a quiet storm inside her. She moved through her routine distractedly, the memory of his touch following her like a whisper. It wasn't just physical, it was how seen she felt in that moment, how present he had been without saying a word. She tried to pretend nothing had changed, but something had within her, and possibly within him too. They didn't speak about it, not directly, but every interaction now had a subtle pause, a charged silence before words found their way. She noticed how he looked at her, not with boldness but with careful intention, like someone who'd crossed a line. He wasn't sure he should have, yet didn't regret. She wondered if he lay awake the way she did, questioning what this connection meant, what future, if any, it had. Later that week she called for him again. Not because her back hurt, but because she needed to feel that closeness, that safety. He entered with his usual calm, but his eyes held a question he didn't ask aloud. She offered him a smile, soft and unsure, It was enough. He started without saying a word, and the silence between them was no longer awkward, but rather intimate. His touch was familiar, but it still gave her a rush of warmth. It felt like their own unspoken language, and she leaned into it both physically and emotionally, allowing herself to be vulnerable again in his presence for the first time. She told him she appreciated him, that she had noticed how kind and gentle he was always, and that he didn't say much back, but his hands slowed, his touch grew even more cautious, and that said more than words could. There was respect in the way he handled her, an understanding that what they shared was delicate, real, and not to be taken lightly.